Pierre Poilievre made a fatal mistake that Tuesday in Parliament. When Pierre Poilievre stood up in question period to attack Mark Carney's economic record, he thought he had found the perfect weapon: unemployment numbers that seemed to support his argument. What Poilievre didn't know was that Carney had been waiting months for exactly this attack, and the response he had prepared would end Poilievre's credibility as an economic critic forever. The exchange lasted 8 minutes and 47 seconds. When it was over, Poilievre sat down in stunned silence. His talking points in ruins, his reputation as an economic expert permanently shattered. The House of Commons erupted, but not for the conservative leader who had walked in thinking he would destroy a prime minister. This is the inside story of the most devastating parliamentary takedown in modern Canadian political history. A moment when preparation met opportunity, when expertise crushed populism, and when one man's arrogance became his downfall. Because sometimes, when you attack a master, you get exactly what you deserve. Tuesday, September 1st, 2025. The House of Commons was packed for what many expected to be a routine question period. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre had been building toward this moment for weeks, telling his caucus that he finally had the ammunition to destroy Mark Carney's economic credibility. But Carney had been preparing for this confrontation even longer. In the Prime Minister's office, Carney's economic team had been tracking every conservative attack line, every misleading statistic, every half-truth that Poilievre had been spreading about the government's economic record. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne, and Chief of Staff Katie Simpson had spent months preparing comprehensive responses to every possible line of attack. "He's going to come at you with the unemployment numbers from last month," Champagne had warned during their morning briefing. "He'll ignore the seasonal adjustments, the regional variations, and the long-term trends. He's betting that most Canadians won't understand the difference between statistical noise and actual economic trends." Carney had nodded calmly. As a former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, he understood economic data at a level that few politicians could match. More importantly, he understood how misleading statistics could be weaponized by those who either didn't understand them or didn't care about accuracy. What Poilievre didn't know was that Carney had been hoping for exactly this attack. The unemployment numbers that Poilievre planned to use were a perfect example of how statistical illiteracy could be exploited for political gain. The raw monthly data showed a slight uptick that looked concerning to casual observers, but anyone with basic economic training would recognize it as normal seasonal variation, part of a broader trend that actually showed remarkable economic strength. Carney had been waiting for someone to make exactly this mistake, because it would give him the opportunity to demonstrate the difference between real economic analysis and political theater. As the House of Commons settled into order that Tuesday afternoon, Carney sat calmly at his desk, reviewing notes that contained more sophisticated economic analysis than most universities taught in their graduate programs. Poilievre, meanwhile, shuffled through his attack sheets with the confidence of someone who believed he had found the perfect weapon. What he actually had found was the perfect way to expose his own incompetence to the entire nation. At 2:47 p.m., Speaker Greg Fergus recognized Pierre Poilievre for the first question of the opposition. Poilievre arose with the theatrical flourish that had become his trademark, waving a sheet of paper that he believed contained political dynamite. "Mr. Speaker," Poilievre began, his voice carrying the mock indignation that conservative focus groups had told him played well on television. "This Prime Minister promised Canadians that his economic policies would create jobs and prosperity, but the numbers don't lie." This was the moment Carney had been anticipating for months. "According to Statistics Canada," Poilievre continued, his voice rising for dramatic effect, "unemployment rose to 6.6% last month. That's 200,000 more Canadians out of work since this Prime Minister took office. How does he explain this economic failure to the Canadian families who are suffering because of his failed policies?" The conservative benches erupted in scripted applause. Poilievre had delivered his attack with the confidence of someone who believed he had just landed a devastating blow. Several conservative MPs were already standing to join the applause, anticipating their leader's moment of triumph. But what happened next would change everything. Instead of the defensive response that Poilievre expected, Carney rose slowly from his seat with the calm demeanor of a professor about to correct a student's fundamental error. There was no anger in his expression, no political theater, just the quiet confidence of someone who was about to demonstrate superior knowledge. If you're watching this because you want to see how real expertise destroys political theater, hit that subscribe button now, because what Carney was about to do would prove that in a battle between preparation and propaganda, knowledge always wins. The House of Commons fell silent as members sensed that something significant was about to happen. Even the conservative MPs who had been applauding moments earlier seemed to recognize that their leader might have walked into something more dangerous than he realized.
The member opposite cites unemployment at 6.6%, Carney continued, pulling out his own documents with the fluid motion of someone completely comfortable with the material. But he conveniently ignores several crucial facts that any serious economic analyst would consider. Carney's voice carried the authority of someone who had briefed finance ministers, central bank governors, and heads of state on economic policy for decades. This wasn't political rhetoric. This was applied economics. First, that figure represents a 0.1% increase from the previous month, which falls well within normal seasonal variation. Second, when adjusted for seasonal factors, a standard practice in economic analysis, unemployment actually decreased by 0.2%. The first blow had been struck, but Carney was just getting started. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the member opposite claims that 200,000 more Canadians are out of work since I took office. This statement is categorically false. The word false hung in the air like an accusation. In parliamentary language, directly contradicting another member's factual claims was the equivalent of calling them a liar, but doing so with documented evidence rather than political rhetoric. Since March 2025, Canada has created 340,000 new jobs. The unemployment rate when I took office was 7.1%. At 6.6%, unemployment is actually 0.5 percentage points lower than when I became Prime Minister. The devastating precision of Carney's response was becoming apparent. Poilievre's confident expression was beginning to change as he realized that his carefully prepared attack was being systematically dismantled with actual data rather than political spin. But let me address the deeper issue here, Carney continued, his tone growing more authoritative. The member opposite has consistently demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how economic statistics work, how labor markets function, and how policy decisions affect real economic outcomes. This was no longer a defensive response to a political attack. This was an economics expert explaining why his critic was simply wrong about basic facts. What happened next was unprecedented in Canadian parliamentary history. Instead of trading political sound bites, Mark Carney began delivering what amounted to a graduate-level lecture on labor economics, using Pierre Poilievre as an unwilling student. Let me explain to the member opposite how unemployment statistics actually work, Carney said, his tone carrying the patient authority of a professor addressing a confused undergraduate. The member opposite also ignores the participation rate, which has increased by 1.2% since March, indicating that more Canadians are actively seeking work, a positive economic indicator that suggests confidence in the job market. Carney paused, letting the technical accuracy of his response sink in before delivering the next blow. Furthermore, the member opposite consistently confuses correlation with causation, seasonal variation with economic trends, and political talking points with actual analysis. But Carney's most devastating critique was still coming. I would encourage the member opposite to review the Bank of Canada's methodology for labor force statistics, the OECD's guidelines for international economic comparison, and perhaps take an introductory course in macroeconomic analysis before attempting to critique economic policy in this House. The suggestion that Poilievre needed to take an introductory economics course was delivered with such calm professionalism that it took several seconds for the full impact to register. When it did, the Liberal benches erupted in laughter, while the Conservative side sat in stunned silence. What do you think about this level of intellectual confrontation in politics? Should leaders be expected to have this depth of technical knowledge? Or was Carney being unfairly harsh? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know if you think this was educational or just political theater. But Carney wasn't finished. Having demonstrated Poilievre's statistical illiteracy, he was about to expose something far more damaging: the Conservative leader's fundamental hypocrisy on economic policy. Since the member opposite seems concerned about unemployment statistics, perhaps he can explain to this House why unemployment in Canada averaged 7.8% during the last Conservative government, compared to 6.1% under Liberal governments over the past decade. The question hit like a guided missile. Poilievre had walked into Parliament planning to attack Carney's economic record, only to have his own party's historical performance thrown back at him with devastating effectiveness. Perhaps he can explain why job creation averaged 120,000 annually during the last Conservative government, while we have created 340,000 jobs in just 6 months. Each comparison was designed to highlight not just the weakness of Poilievre's current attack, but the broader failure of Conservative economic policy when they had actually been in power. Perhaps he can explain why economic growth averaged 1.8% during the last Conservative government, while Canada leads the G7 in economic growth projections for 2025 and 2026. The pattern was clear. Every metric Poilievre had tried to use as a weapon was actually better under Liberal leadership. And perhaps most importantly, he can explain to Canadian families why they should trust economic advice from someone who clearly doesn't understand how economic statistics are calculated, how labor markets function, or how his own party's economic record compares to the government he's attempting to criticize. The final question wasn't just a response to Poilievre's attack. It was a comprehensive demolition of his credibility as an economic critic. Carney had taken every element of the Conservative attack and turned it into evidence of Conservative incompetence.
The House of Commons erupted. Liberal MPs were on their feet applauding, not just for their leader's defense, but for the intellectual tour de force they had just witnessed. Conservative MPs sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond to such a comprehensive dismantling of their leader's position. Pierre Poilievre attempted a response, but the damage was already done. His follow-up question about inflation was met with an equally devastating response that included references to global commodity prices, supply chain disruptions, and monetary policy coordination that made it clear he was arguing with someone who understood the subject at a level he couldn't match. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were trending on social media. Carney destroys Poilievre became the top trending topic in Canada, with videos of the parliamentary exchange being shared across all platforms. But this wasn't just political entertainment. It was a demonstration of the difference between expertise and populism, between knowledge and rhetoric. Economic analysts from across the political spectrum praised Carney's response for its technical accuracy and comprehensive scope. Quote, "This is what it looks like when someone who actually understands economics responds to political attacks," end quote, wrote former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge. Conservative commentators struggled to defend Poilievre's position. Several quietly acknowledged that their leader had been outclassed by someone with superior knowledge and preparation. But the most significant reaction came from Canadian voters. Polling conducted in the days following the exchange showed a dramatic shift in public perception. Carney's approval rating jumped by 12 points, while Poilievre's credibility on economic issues dropped significantly. More importantly, the exchange had established a template for how technical expertise could be used to counter populist political attacks. By responding with facts rather than rhetoric, data rather than sound bites, Carney had shown how knowledgeable leaders could defend good policy against uninformed criticism. In the weeks following the parliamentary exchange, political observers noted a significant change in how conservative MPs approached economic questions. The casual misuse of statistics that had been common in conservative attacks became much more rare, as opposition members realized they risked similar public embarrassment. Poilievre himself seemed to recognize that his approach needed adjustment. His subsequent parliamentary questions became more cautious, more technically accurate, and less reliant on misleading statistical claims. The man who had built his reputation on aggressive political attacks was forced to acknowledge that some opponents required more careful preparation. For Carney, the exchange had accomplished something beyond defending his economic record. It had established his credibility as a leader who could not only implement good policy, but defend it with intellectual rigor that his critics couldn't match. The parliamentary showdown had demonstrated a crucial principle. In an era of post-truth politics and alternative facts, technical expertise remained a powerful weapon for leaders who knew how to use it. Carney had shown that the best response to political theater wasn't better theater, it was better knowledge. The exchange became required viewing in political science courses across Canada as an example of how preparation, expertise, and calm professionalism could defeat even the most aggressive political attacks. But perhaps most importantly, it sent a message to anyone thinking of challenging Mark Carney on his areas of expertise. Come prepared, or don't come at all. Because in a battle between knowledge and rhetoric, between facts and spin, between expertise and populism, the most prepared mind always wins. Pierre Poilievre had learned that lesson the hard way, in front of millions of Canadians in the most public forum possible. It was a lesson he would never forget, and one that would shape Canadian political discourse for years to come. The 8 minutes and 47 seconds that destroyed a political career had also elevated the standard for what Canadians could expect from their leaders. Not just good intentions or passionate rhetoric, but the knowledge and competence to defend good policy with facts that couldn't be disputed. In the end, that may have been Mark Carney's greatest victory, not just defeating an opponent, but raising the bar for everyone who would follow.